Iran has been completely destroyed over the past 2 weeks by the United States and Israel. There is no longer an Ayatollah Khamenei. The Middle East's future has already been irreversibly altered by the Iranian military's total chaos. Tactically, Washington and Jerusalem have been extremely successful, gaining air superiority over a large portion of Iran's land and using any weaponry they choose to hit the targets at any time. Israel is reducing its adversary to rubble after decades of fighting a regional Cold War, and the United States is so sure of its power that Donald Trump has already proclaimed victory. However, victories on the battlefield are insufficient to win a war. Additionally, there is currently a huge difference between the strategic victory that the two allies are pursuing and the tactical superiority of the US and Israel. The Strait of Hormuz is closed after 2 weeks of non-stop bombing, but the Middle East as a whole, particularly the oil-rich Gulf states, remains under continual threat. The new supreme leader of Iran is unwilling to make concessions. He is really more orthodox than his father was, and Iran's recent rhetoric suggests that Tehran has no intention of compromising. Even a cursory look at the headlines would reveal that the United States, Israel, and their allies are winning the great majority of daily conflicts. Who is winning the war though? Answering that question is more difficult. The argument in favor of the coalition now: what constitutes victory in international conflicts? There is no competitiveness in war. It's not some kind of destructive competition in which one side wins a trophy and the right to brag by killing more opponents or destroying more objects. The purpose of war is to achieve a goal. Countries go to war because they want something so strongly that they will fight for it and because their adversary wants the opposing result so badly that they will fight back. A combat force has the ability to utterly outclass its opponent and rule the battlefield. However, they haven't won if their men return home and the war effort is over before the fighting force achieves its goals. It is also true in reverse. During a battle, a combat force may be completely destroyed, sustain enormous damage and lose far more than its opponent. However, they can still consider it a success if that combat force succeeds in achieving its goals. We are now using this film to support one side or to inform supporters of Trump, Netanyahu, or the Iranian government, respectively, that their favorite fighting group is headed for an unavoidable defeat. We want to know who is winning the war in Iran, since the current state of affairs is unclear. The most we can do for the time being is to outline each side's assertion that it is gaining the upper hand and the reasons we shouldn't take such claims at face value. The conflict is still going on, and each side has a chance to accomplish its main goals.
We'll begin with the U.S.-Israeli alliance, where Washington and Jerusalem are winning the most straightforward argument that we have already outlined. During their air assault, the Israelis and Americans have accomplished amazing tactical victories. They claim to have murdered thousands of Iranian soldiers and paramilitary members in addition to dozens of Iranian leaders. They have destroyed the majority of Iranian air power and sent a sizable portion of Iran's navy to the bottom of the sea. Iran's military infrastructure has been largely destroyed or severely damaged. U.S. and Israeli air defenses have been successful in protecting the surrounding airspace, and control of the sky is now so complete that U.S. heavy bombers may fly above Iran covertly. As of this writing, the Israeli side has reportedly murdered 2 soldiers and 16 civilians, while the United States has suffered fewer than 10 casualties on its own. Even if both countries' military equipment has been damaged, they have inflicted far more harm on Iran than either Israel or the United States has had to bear. Iran has failed to engage the coalition in expensive ground combat and is unable to seriously contest coalition air power. Whatever you name the situation, the United States and Israel are definitely not losing, even if they haven't yet accomplished all of their goals. Examine the fundamental goals that the U.S. and Israel appear to be pursuing: the termination of Iran's nuclear program, the overthrow of the Iranian regime, and the removal of any Iranian threat to Israel or the larger Middle East, among other things. Indeed, there are certain issues with the coalition's wartime goals, particularly with regard to the United States, but the general points are clear. There will never again be Iranian ayatollahs endangering Israel, the United States, or any of their friends. The U.S. and Israel aren't much closer to reaching those goals now than they were 2 weeks ago, despite all the harm they've caused. It's unclear how they will get there, which could be even worse.
Generate by AI.
Consider the problem of regime change. Coalition leaders may or may not list a regime change as a primary goal on any given day, depending on who you question. However, at the very least, they want to ensure that Iran is governed by individuals who won't be a problem in the future. However, Iran's new leaders aren't moderating despite the deaths of the country's former supreme leader, his inner circle, and a large number of his friends throughout the system. According to both Iranian and Israeli sources, Iran's extremely potent Revolutionary Guard Corps actively promoted Mujtaba Khomeini, the country's new supreme leader, who is really more of a hardliner than his father ever was. He is the leader of an Iranian party that is among the nation's most ideologically hostile to Israel and the United States. There are several ways the coalition can change the regime. However, it appears that those tools are becoming less effective. The United States might assassinate Mujtaba Khomeini, his successor, and so on, until they find a leader who is more cooperative, such as Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. However, according to Donald Trump's own admission, the majority of the individuals the U.S. may have selected for that position perished in the initial attacks. There was a lot of conjecture at the beginning of the conflict that Iranian citizens might rebel, and Israel in particular has gone about giving guns and tiny drones, destroying police and internal security facilities, and otherwise creating the conditions for an insurrection. However, it hasn't happened yet, in part because the devastation hasn't been severe enough for Iranians to risk defying their leaders, and in part because Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu called for a popular uprising well before the circumstances were favorable for anything of the sort. When stories do emerge from within Iran, it is evident that the general public is losing confidence in the leadership of the U.S. and Israel and its capacity to achieve important goals. Additionally, the element of surprise for a Kurdish-led ground assault has been lost, even though the coalition may still back it. Reuters reports that U.S. intelligence came to the conclusion a few days ago that the Iranian regime is not in danger of collapsing following nearly 2 weeks of bombing. However, some of the most significant Iranian attacks have not been stopped by coalition forces. Attacks by missiles, particularly drones, on important infrastructure and economic resources in the Middle East. Iran has shut down and seriously damaged refineries and natural gas infrastructure throughout the region, including in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Oman. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed, and ships now largely refuse to cross the strait. It has thus led to a sharp increase in the cost of energy worldwide. Iran was able to prevent a total economic crisis in less than 2 weeks by forcing the globe to release 400 million barrels of reserve oil, the largest market intervention in history. The well-hidden long-range drone stockpiles that have enabled Iran's devastation have not been eliminated by the alliance. This implies that even while Iran has suffered the most harm, it can still pose a threat to the area by stifling international trade and energy markets. There are still other options for the U.S. and Israel to escalate. They might start ground operations, either with specific goals like assassinations or seizing Kard Island, which is vital to Iran's economy, or by increasing the number of troops on the border to raise the possibility of a more extensive invasion, as the coalition did on March 11th, when it attacked a data center that supplies the bank Iranian military depend on to receive their paychecks. They might strike part of the infrastructure that enables the regime to operate. However, there is no assurance that a regime collapse will occur next. Not that it would happen soon, anyway. The support that Trump's administration received for this operation, whether it came from local or foreign sources, is already diminishing. As of this writing, the majority of Americans are categorically against the war, according to the most recent public opinion surveys. Globally, nobody can determine what U.S. President Donald J. Trump wants from this continuous conflict with Iran, as French President Emmanuel Macron stated at a video conference of G7 members this week. Israeli sources claim that even Jerusalem is getting ready for the prospect that the U.S. would abruptly leave the conflict without accomplishing any more goals, in which case Israel would likely have to cease its operations as well. This is the point at which we pose the query. Is it a triumph if the U.S. pulls out shortly and things seem to be going well overall? Prior to delving into the Iranian aspect of this predicament, we must take a moment to emphasize where one may find additional information about the current struggle in the Middle East, as well as several other crises and geopolitical flashpoints that influence our world. The argument for Iran when we look at Iran's side of the story. The coalition will benefit from what is going poorly for Iran and vice versa. Iran is undoubtedly getting its ass kicked at the moment, regardless of anything else. Its military has been weakened, its long-term, gradual economic disaster has worsened, and its pre-war leadership has been destroyed. However, Iran is pursuing the primary goal of survival during the war. In contrast to the U.S. and Israel, the Islamic Republic is now surviving, and while its attacks on the Gulf states and other regional governments are obviously misguided, its fundamental strategy of going to war with the West has been effective. The Strait of Hormuz was forced to close by Iranian missiles, drones, and sea mines, which also made it possible for Iran to control the world economy. Iran would have performed appallingly poorly if it had been waging this war and attempting to fulfill the standards of victory set by the United States or Israel. Iran isn't doing that, though. They are held to different standards since they are pursuing distinct goals. Iran's objective is the Islamic Republic's existence, not the survival of specific individuals or even important leaders. And the Islamic Republic of Iran is still in existence today. However, there is a crucial issue for Iran. The conflict is still ongoing. Iran can only accomplish its objective once the fight is over, since its objective is to preserve rather than defeat anything. Iran is losing its ability to control when the battle ends, Even though the coalition's destruction of so much Iranian capability does not imply that Iran is completely destroyed. Iran has only one option if it is unable to make that choice and is already engaged in combat. Hold on tight and hope that the coalition decides to stop fighting because the cost of its war is too high or for some other reason. The coalition may be subject to the expenses of war imposed by Iran. By blocking the Strait of Hormuz and launching attacks throughout the Middle East, it has been attempting to do precisely that. However, Iran's capacity to impose those costs is deteriorating daily because of the arse kicking it has already experienced. What Iran still has in its arsenal is unknown to anyone outside of Iran. Iran's leaders most likely don't know either at this point in the conflict. However, we are aware that Iran possesses a limited quantity of missiles, drones, and launchers, not to mention the personnel who have received the necessary training. Every time Iran launches its weapons, it exposes launch locations and infrastructure that may be monitored, targeted, and destroyed. As a result, the more Iran utilizes its remaining ability to fight wars, the more of it is at risk. As demonstrated, Iran is capable of destroying targets in the Middle East if necessary. However, Iran's policy is most effective when its military might is employed as a deterrent rather than a destructive weapon. Iran could immediately begin making serious threats against the region if the conflict ended tomorrow and it still possessed missiles, drones, and sea mines. But the problem is that Iran's enemies are aware of this. Iran's targets are also aware of this. Reports from the Gulf states suggest that while national governments are incensed over the U.S. and Israel's choice to endanger regional security, their intentions are evident. If you're going to start this war, then make sure you finish the job. For Washington, Jerusalem, and really the entire Western world, it's basically the same calculus. Maybe this war was avoidable, and maybe the jury's still out on whether or not it was a good idea. But the worst thing the coalition could do now would be to back down. If that happens, then the Iranian regime survives. A more hardline government becomes entrenched, and the country's entire strategy of regional disruption is rewarded, meaning that this new, even more extremist leadership will double down for the next round. Hell, just imagine the implications for Iran's desire to build a nuclear weapon if conventional weapons can cause this kind of chaos. So while there's a decent argument that Iran could declare victory today if the merit of Israel chose to end the war, Iran might also have shot itself in the foot and created a set of conditions where the coalition can't end its operations while the Iranian regime survives.